There was a secret so dangerous that the people who discovered it were ordered never to speak of it. It wasn't hidden in a vault. It wasn't locked behind enemy lines. It was buried inside something they let their enemies touch, sit inside, and fly. And when one man climbed out of that cockpit, his hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the realization that everything his commanders believed was wrong. He wrote his report, and when it reached the top, the room went silent. Because what he found didn't just change one battle, it changed the entire war, and they buried it, because the truth was too dangerous to admit. Drop a comment below. Tell us where in the world you're watching. Whether you're sitting in London, New York, or somewhere in between, we want to know. This community watches from every corner of the globe, and every single location surprises us. June 1944. A captured airfield. Somewhere deep inside Germany. A silver aircraft sat alone on the tarmac. No American markings. No Allied insignia. Just a sleek, quiet machine repainted with German crosses, waiting in the early morning light. The man walking toward. It was no ordinary pilot. His name was Walter Wolfram. He was 21 years old. He already had over 100 aerial victories to his name. He had been shot down 3 times, wounded 4 times. He had made 12 emergency landings, and survived every single one. He had once sunk a Soviet gunboat from the cockpit of a fighter aircraft. The Luftwaffe, Germany's Air Force, had chosen him specifically for this mission. They needed answers. American fighters had begun appearing over German skies in growing numbers. The North American P-51 Mustang, a machine that was killing German pilots at a rate that frightened even the most senior commanders. They needed to know why. They needed to know how. And most importantly, they needed to know if there was a weakness somewhere inside that aircraft that could be exploited. Wolfram was their answer. What the Luftwaffe did not expect was what he would actually find. The Germans had been quietly collecting crashed Allied aircraft for months. A specialized secret unit, known informally as the Circus Rosarius, repaired these machines, repainted them with German markings, and flew them from airfield to airfield. Elite pilots were invited to climb inside, to study, to analyze, to report back. It was one of the most sophisticated intelligence operations of the entire war. And on this particular morning in June 1944, Walter Wolfram climbed into the cockpit of a captured P-51 Mustang. His first impression was immediate. The cockpit was enormous. After thousands of hours inside the tight, narrow confines of the Bf-109, Germany's most celebrated fighter, the Mustang felt like stepping into a different world entirely. Everything felt far away. Everything felt unfamiliar. But Wolfram was a professional. He pushed his discomfort aside, settled into the seat, wrapped his hands around the controls, and prepared to discover the secret that would shake the Luftwaffe to its core. There is a moment in every war when one side realizes something the other side already knows. That moment arrived for Walter Wolfram at approximately 10,000 feet above Germany, in the cockpit of an enemy aircraft. With his hand resting on a throttle that did not belong to his own Air Force, he pushed it forward, and the Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine responded, not with the familiar growl of his Bf-19's Daimler-Benz engine. Something different, something smoother, something almost unsettlingly confident in the way it delivered power, as if the aircraft itself had nothing to prove. The Merlin V1650 produced 1,590 horsepower at combat ratings. That alone was impressive. But horsepower was not the secret. German engineers understood horsepower. What they did not fully appreciate, not until pilots like Wolfram climbed into these machines and felt it firsthand, was the consistency of that power. At high altitude, where the thin air starved most engines of oxygen and performance dropped sharply, the Mustang's 2-stage supercharger simply adjusted, automatically, without any input from the pilot. The fuel mixture corrected itself. The power remained. The aircraft continued climbing as if altitude itself was irrelevant. The Bf-109 had no such luxury. German pilots at high altitude constantly managed their engines, manually adjusting mixture, monitoring pressure, compensating for conditions that the Mustang handled entirely on its own. Every moment spent managing the engine was a moment not spent watching the sky around them. But then Wolfram noticed something that stopped him completely. Something so simple, so almost embarrassingly basic, that it struck him harder than any performance statistic ever could. There were no oil leaks. He checked again. He looked at the gauge. He scanned the engine cowling. Nothing. The Merlin engine was running with a cleanliness and precision that German mechanics exhausted, working in bombed-out hangars with diminishing spare parts, could only dream of achieving. Wolfram had fought through Russian winters, He understood what oil leaks meant in temperatures that dropped 40 degrees below zero. He had watched mechanics work through freezing nights trying to coax reluctant engines back to life. He had personally made 12 emergency landings, some of them caused by exactly this kind of mechanical failure. And here was an enemy engine, simply working. Fellow German ace Günther Rall flew these same captured aircraft and reached the same conclusion. After the war, Rall described it plainly. The engine had no oil leak. That was just fantastic. 300 hours they flew these captured machines. 300 hours, and the Merlin never failed them. This was not merely a mechanical observation. This was a warning. Because behind that reliable engine stood something no German factory could match. In 1944, American industrial capacity was producing over 100 P-51 Mustangs every single week. Each one precisely built. Each one virtually identical to the last. Each one ready to fly the moment it rolled off the production line. Germany was producing aircraft too. More than ever, in fact. But the pilots to fly them were dying faster than training programs could replace them, and the machines themselves increasingly built with substitute materials by exhausted workers. Inside factories that Allied bombers visited regularly were no longer the precision instruments they once were. Wolfram understood all of this from inside that cockpit. He hadn't yet landed. He hadn't yet written his report. But the intelligence he was gathering wasn't coming from instruments or gauges or performance charts. It was coming from his hands, from the controls beneath his fingers, from the way the aircraft responded to every input with a calm, effortless authority that told him everything he needed to know. The P-51 was not just a better fighter in certain conditions. It was a weapon built by a nation that had decided systematically and deliberately to bury its enemies under the sheer weight of what it could produce. And Germany had no answer for that. Some discoveries change a battle. Others change a war. And then, there are discoveries so fundamental, so deeply uncomfortable that the people who make them wish for just a brief moment that they had never looked at all. Walter Wolfram was now at altitude. The captured P-51 beneath him moved through the German sky with a smoothness that felt almost offensive. He banked left, then right. He pushed the nose down into a steep dive, the kind of dive that separated good aircraft from great ones, the kind where lesser machines began to shake, buffet, and warn their pilots that they were approaching the edge of what the airframe could tolerate. The Mustang did not shake. It accelerated what Wolfram was experiencing, though the precise engineering language would come later, was the P-51's laminar flow wing. Designed by North American's chief engineer Edgar Schmood, in cooperation with American aeronautical researchers, this wing was shaped to maintain smooth, ordered airflow across a far greater portion of its surface than any conventional design of that era. The result was a wing that was slippery in a way that felt almost unnatural, at speeds above 320 miles per hour. Precisely the speeds at which aerial combat over Germany was now being fought. The Mustang became more confident, not less. The controls remained sharp. The aircraft felt stable, while other fighters tightened, stiffened, and warned their pilots to slow down. The P-51 simply asked for more. But there was something else hidden inside that wing. Something that no one, not even the engineers who designed it, fully anticipated at the time. By a complete accident of geometry, the laminar flow wing shape also happened to be extraordinarily efficient at high Mach numbers. The speeds approaching the sound barrier, where air compressed, where control surfaces lost effectiveness, where the difference between a controlled dive and a fatal structural failure was measured in fractions of a second. The P-51's critical Mach number, the speed at which compressibility effects began causing dangerous handling problems, was 0.78. The Bf-109 was 0.75. The FW-190 was 0.75. The P-47 Thunderbolts was 0.71. The P-38 Lightning was 0.68. 3 points of Mach numbers separating the Mustang from its nearest German competitor. 3 points that in any engineering textbook might appear trivial, but at 30,000 feet, in a diving engagement where both pilots were pushing their machines toward the absolute limit, those 3 points were the difference between pulling out and not. Wolfram tested the turn performance next. Here, finally, the Bf-109 held its own. The German fighter's automatic leading-edge slats deployed at low speed, maintaining lift as the aircraft approached stall, allowing tighter turns than the heavier Mustang could match in slow-speed maneuvering. German ace Kurt Bulligan, minus 112 victories on the Western Front, confirmed this after the war. His pilots could outearn the P-51 and the Bf-109 and the FW-190. The turn rates were comparable, and German armament 20mm cannon, alongside 13mm machine guns, hit harder than the Mustang's 6.50 caliber machine guns. On paper, Germany was competitive. But Wolfram understood something that paper could not capture. The P-51 pilot did not need to turn. American pilots had been specifically trained to exploit their aircraft's strengths to maintain speed, to dive and zoom, to disengage from slow-turning fights and re-engage on their own terms. They had been trained to fight the war that their aircraft was built for, and their aircraft had been built for a war of endurance. The Bf-109 carried fuel for approximately 90 minutes of combat operations. The P-51, with its 2 external drop tanks, carried enough fuel for 7 hours. 7 hours against 90 minutes. Wolfram had flown enough combat missions to understand immediately what that number meant. It did not mean the P-51 was faster. It did not mean it turned better. It did not mean its guns hit harder. It meant that when a German pilot was checking his fuel gauge and preparing to disengage, the American pilot was still fresh, still hunting, still there. And that realization, quiet, clinical, and devastating, was the most important thing Walter Wolfram brought back from that cockpit. Not performance data, not technical specifications. The knowledge that Germany was now fighting an opponent who could simply outlast them. Every single time. There is a particular kind of defeat that does not arrive loudly. It does not announce itself with a single catastrophic battle, or a dramatic turning point that historians can circle on a map. It arrives quietly, methodically, in the accumulated weight of 1,000 small disadvantages, each one manageable alone, but together, absolutely fatal. Walter Wolfram landed the captured P-51 Mustang and climbed out of the cockpit. He sat down, he collected his thoughts, and then he wrote his report, with the same precision and honesty that had made him one of the most respected fighter pilots in the entire Luftwaffe. He did not exaggerate. He did not dramatize. He simply described what he had experienced: the enormous cockpit, the effortless engine, the slippery wing, the unsettling smoothness of an aircraft that never seemed to reach its limit, and submitted it to his superiors. The report traveled up the chain of command, and when it reached Luftwaffe High Command, the room went quiet. Not because the information was entirely surprising. Senior German commanders had been receiving fragments of this intelligence for months. Individual pilots had reported similar observations. Technical analysts had studied captured components and drawn similar conclusions. The room went quiet because of what the report confirmed. Germany had not lost the air war in a single battle. It had not lost it through a failure of courage or skill or individual brilliance. German pilots, men like Wolfram, like Gunther Rall, like Erich Hartmann, were arguably the most talented fighter pilots the world had ever produced. Their victories were documented. Their skills were real. But skill had a ceiling. And above that ceiling sat mathematics. On March 4, 1944, just months before Wolfram's evaluation, Flight P-51Bs of the 4th Fighter Group had escorted American bombers all the way to Berlin. Round trip, 1,100 miles. Colonel Donald Blakesley's pilots arrived over the German capital with fuel remaining. Hermann Göring, Reichsmarschall, commander of the entire German Air Force, reportedly stood at a window and watched American fighters circling over Berlin. He said quietly, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up." This was not the statement of a man reacting to a surprise. This was the statement of a man confirming something he had feared for a very long time. Something that reports like Wolfram's had been warning about. Something that the mathematics had been predicting for months. The Luftwaffe's strategic assumption that American bombers flying deep into Germany were beyond the protection of Allied fighters had been the foundation of their entire defensive strategy. German fighter units were deliberately positioned beyond the assumed range of American escorts. They waited. They conserved their strength. They planned to tear apart the unprotected bomber formations at will. That assumption was now dead, and with it, the entire defensive architecture built around it. The tactical recommendations that followed Wolfram's report were logical and precise. Avoid prolonged engagements with P-51s. Attack quickly and disengage immediately. Use the Bf-109's superior climb rate to escape vertically. Force engagements to low altitude and low speed where German aircraft held relative advantages. Reasonable advice. Professional advice. Completely insufficient advice. Because the fundamental problem was not tactical. It was not a question of technique or training or individual courage. The fundamental problem was that by early 1944, American industry was producing over 100 P-51 Mustangs every single week. On March 6, 1944, just 2 days after that first Berlin escort mission, more than 900 American fighters accompanied over 800 bombers to the German capital. 900 fighters against a Luftwaffe that was losing experienced pilots at a rate that no training program could replace. Major General James Doolittle, the new commander of the 8th Air Force, had quietly changed the rules of engagement. P-51 pilots were no longer ordered to fly close escort alongside the bombers. They were released, unleashed. ordered to hunt the Luftwaffe wherever they could find it. They swept ahead of bomber formations, catching German fighters as they climbed to intercept. They strafed airfields, destroying aircraft on the ground before they ever reached altitude. They pursued damaged German fighters relentlessly until the pilot either crashed or abandoned his aircraft. This was not aerial combat in any traditional sense. This was systematic elimination. During a single week in February 1944, a massive bombing offensive that American planners called Big Week, Mustang pilots destroyed 17% of the Luftwaffe's experienced fighter pilots in air-to-air combat. 17%. In 7 days, these were not replaceable men. Germany was training new pilots constantly, but the gap between a new pilot with 100 hours of flight time and a combat veteran with 400 hours was not a gap that additional training could quickly close. It was a gap measured in survival. New German pilots entering combat in mid-1944 lasted days, sometimes hours. The experienced men who might have mentored them, who might have transferred hard-won knowledge through example and instruction, were gone, shot down over Berlin, over Hamburg, over the oil fields of Ploiesti. Over 100 other targets that the P-51 now reached with casual, devastating ease. Wolfram himself felt this erosion firsthand. On July 16, 1944, the same day he claimed 10 aerial victories in a single engagement, he was severely wounded. He spent months in convalescence. When he finally returned to combat in February 1945 and took command of his unit, the Luftwaffe he rejoined was unrecognizable. The pilots were young, frightened, undertrained. The aircraft was still being produced. German factories had actually increased production in 1944, despite Allied bombing, but the men qualified to fly them with genuine combat effectiveness were almost gone. Wolfram understood what this meant. He had read the mathematics long before the mathematics reached their conclusion. And on May 8, 1945, when the war in Europe finally ended, Walter Wolfram's unit was at Deutschbrod airfield in Czechoslovakia. They laid down their weapons. They surrendered to the Americans. The men who had once represented the most elite fighter wing in aviation history handed themselves over to the pilots of the aircraft that Walter Wolfram had climbed into on a quiet June morning in 1944, and described with professional honesty and quiet devastation as a fine airplane.